Good evening and welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. It's Nancy Miller, the creator and host of the podcast. And if you are new to this podcast, I have two things to say. The first is welcome. And the second is I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Because if you've landed here, it means you likely struggle with insomnia. And in a fit of desperation, you somehow discovered this show. And to that, I say good. Because there's nothing lonelier than being wide awake in the middle of the night when it seems like everyone else is asleep. So you are not alone. Dead Sleep is a niche podcast I've created for people just like me, just like us. People who like to unwind their mind with a mindful mystery, without the gory, gratuitous violence, and perhaps most appealing, without a bunch of poorly mixed, obnoxiously loud ads. So if you're at that stage where you've tried everything, gummies, melatonin, NyQuil, Ambien, give Dead Sleep a try. It's only $5 a month, and you get a bonus episode each month. Thank you so much for supporting me and for supporting the podcast. You can try it for free. 7 days on Patreon, a free month on Apple Podcasts. And as soon as Spotify offers something like that, I'd be happy to explore that as well. More on how to subscribe in the show notes. Now, as we settle in for the night, making our hot chocolate, or letting the serums soak in, I'm going to share a quote I heard a while back, one that struck me as clever and potentially enlightening, and most definitely connected to the story you'll hear tonight. Yesterday is history. Tomorrow is a mystery. Today is a gift. And that is why it is called the present. Depending on your source, that is a quote from either Eleanor Roosevelt or Master Oogway, the talking tortoise from Kung Fu Panda. But either way, the sentiment is the same. The present is a gift. But what if the present is not what you'd hope for? What if right now sucks? It's the reason why we stay awake at night, tossing and turning, worrying, trying to figure out what's going to happen next. If we could only see just a little bit into the future, to know what was going to happen tomorrow, then we could get a sense of control over things. A bit of calm amidst all this chaos. But well, for most of us, life doesn't work like that. When things are uncomfortable, painful in the present, well, we just get through it and see what tomorrow brings. We have no choice. But the woman you're going to hear about tonight, she was different. She was so determined to find out her destiny. She was willing to pay a fortune for someone to illuminate her fate. And tonight is about how a chance encounter led to a dangerous connection, one that would lead to disastrous consequences. a series of tragic events that only one person could have seen coming. This is, of course, a story about a stupefying scam, but it's also a saga about grief, tragic loss, and the lengths we will go to avoid what you might call the agony of the unknown. And how a woman went so far into the future, she couldn't find her way back to the present. This is, of course, the Dead Sleep version of events, where we take things at a different pace. And while there are no depictions of graphic violence, there's some pretty heavy emotional stuff in this episode. The word that comes to mind is malevolence. And even though this is one story that took place a few years ago, what happened here is not only still happening, this malevolence, this emotional manipulation and predation has metastasized. It's everywhere. So I wanted to explore it so we can better understand it. Our story begins in the bustling center of New York City. Just steps away from Central Park is the Plaza Hotel, a longtime luxury destination for the world's most famous, from F. Scott Fitzgerald to Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Lloyd Wright to Frank Sinatra. On this particular day in 1991, the Plaza Hotel was the temporary home of an attractive blonde in her mid-40s. Few would recognize her face, but millions of people, mostly women, knew her words by heart. She was Jude Deveraux, the best-selling author behind a series of popular romance novels, and her latest offering was her biggest blockbuster yet. The book was called A Knight in Shining Armor, and it was a groundbreaking time-traveling love story between a modern-day woman circa 1988 and a 16th century medieval knight. Jude Deveraux considered herself a romance novelist in the truest sense. She didn't peddle smut like Jackie Collins. Her books were about a woman seeking the man of her dreams, getting married, living happily ever after. If only she could take pen to paper in her own romantic life, which had recently become very complicated. A situation with her husband that ended, at least for now, with Jude fleeing her own Manhattan apartment and taking up residence at the Plaza Hotel, at least until she figured things out. Somehow, her real life had become more dramatic than anything she'd ever written about in her novels. And to think it all started so innocently. Just Jude, going on vacation, trekking to Egypt, to what was supposed to be the vacation of a lifetime. And yet, once there, as everyone else marveled over the ancient pyramids, Jude Deveraux was more awestruck by the very young, very handsome tour guide. And over the course of her stay, what was apparently a playful flirtation between Jude and this Egyptian gentleman, well, it turned into something much more. A real connection. One that Jude, perhaps, maybe, wanted to explore. It sounded ridiculous. Impossible. This tour guide, he was half her age and lived in Cairo. But Jude couldn't help but wonder. Maybe this was her destiny. But like any love story, there were obstacles, starting with her husband, Claude. When Jude and Claude fell in love, they were married to different people at the time, but their mutual passion propelled them into a love affair, one that led to Jude and Claude leaving their respective spouses, living together in Kentucky, eventually moving to New York City, then getting married in 1987. And now, after all these years, as Jude Devereaux's books topped the New York Times bestseller list, her marriage to Claude, it had hit rock bottom, which put everything else she'd worked for in jeopardy. She wrote the books, but Claude, he oversaw everything else in their lives. Claude was a decade older than Jude, and back when she was in her 20s, she was no doubt attracted to his more mature bearing, his paternal guidance, his protection, and his business savvy. Claude had helped turn Jude Devereaux, the writer, into Jude Devereaux, the brand. But who was Jude Devereaux? Was she a person or a persona? Jude's real last name was Gilliam. But Jude Gilliam, she was just a girl from suburban Louisville, Kentucky. Jude Devereaux, however, was a sophisticated, glamorous romance author. And yet, something about her dynamic with Claude, it made her feel like a child. He reviewed every dollar she spent. He approved every check. Jude found herself dependent on Claude in a way she wasn't sure worked anymore. All of this rattled around the mind of Jude Devereaux as she fell into a brisk step with all the other millions of other people on the busy city streets. Young and old, rich and poor, tourists and natives, each one, no doubt, with their own worries, their own complicated and troubled lives. This was just part of being human. But Jude was lost, and she needed help. Therapy? No. She didn't need anyone to tell her what was wrong with her. What she needed was someone who could see the big picture, a view from above and beyond. Someone who wouldn't judge her like her friends and family no doubt would. Someone who had something to give, not just take. So perhaps it seemed like fate when Jude turned a corner along 58th Street, just a few blocks from the Plaza Hotel, and spotted a rather unassuming storefront that was, in fact, filled with intrigue. The sign somewhere out front read Astrology Life and offered astrological readings for a very reasonable fee, somewhere around $20. Jude considered going in. What could be the harm? For centuries, all kinds of people, from the curious to the deeply troubled, have sought advice from someone who claimed to have a certain gift, or they could intuit things we overlooked, or foresee events that haven't happened yet. Even connect with those who are no longer with us. Over these centuries, countless people have wandered in, willing to spend a little money to get a glimpse into their future and some guidance on what to do. The woman who greeted Jude Devereaux, she appeared to be around Jude's age, mid-40s. But it was clear this woman had a gift that made her wise beyond her years. She introduced herself. She was Joyce Michaels. And her last name, Michaels, that was a nod to Michael the Archangel, the Prince of Heavenly Forces, defender of the good from all that was evil. Joyce Michaels welcomed Jude assuring her Archangel Michael had guided Joyce and her ancestors, generations of spiritual advisors spanning hundreds of years. Since Joyce's ancestors migrated from South Asia to Persia, then Armenia, then fanning across Greater Europe until they found their way to America, to New York City, where Joyce used her gifts to help the lives and careers and fortunes of some of the biggest celebrities, the most powerful CEOs, people who, like Jude, stayed at the Plaza Hotel right over there. It was fate that brought them together. Joyce was sure of it. There was something about Joyce, her voice, her intensity, the atmosphere, the dimmed lights, the soft candles, the tinkling of the crystals, a little room far away from the chaos outside. Whatever it was, Jude immediately felt drawn to Joyce, and she trusted her. And before she knew it, she told Joyce everything. As Joyce listened, affirmed, taking in all of the details, Joyce kept track of everything Jude Devereaux said and what she didn't say. And Jude said a lot. She spilled it all about her troubled marriage, how she was torn between two men, how she didn't know what to do. And Jude wondered if Joyce had the power. Could she possibly see something, anything, about her future? Joyce assured Jude she could help. And she came back another day, then another. Why not? Visiting Joyce was easy, just down the street from her hotel, and her guidance cost less than a therapist. And it was clear early on that Joyce Michaels, she was the real deal. She told her that Jude's husband, Claude, he wasn't her soulmate, and she predicted the two would be separated soon enough. This prediction would prove true. And during the time Jude was apart from her husband, she grew resentful of how she did the work, churning out all the books, and yet it was Claude who decided how she spent her money. And throughout all of this time, Jude continued to see Joyce, the only person in her life who actually listened. And you couldn't put a price on that, though her husband, Claude, had tried. At one point during their separation, Claude saw Jude had written out a hefty check to someone, a woman named Joyce Michaels. And the amount on that check, it was for $40,000. When Claude asked Jude about this check, she told him it was for research, for a book she was writing. And indeed, right there on the lower left of the check, in the section called Memo, Jude had written the word research. Claude couldn't help but notice it was for a lot of money. But soon enough, this wouldn't be any of Claude's business. The two were getting a divorce. Joyce even predicted the exact date and time that the divorce papers would arrive. She told Jude not to worry about Claude. She'd predicted that her soon-to-be ex-husband didn't have long to live. Joyce Michaels predicted he'd be dead within a few years, and there was nothing Jude could do about it, except maybe give him a generous divorce settlement. It was Joyce, not a lawyer, who suggested the extravagant and unprecedented terms, Jude agreeing to not only paying her husband's monthly alimony, but included in their agreement was an offer to increase his payments year over year. The estimated amount was tied to Jude's book sales. So basically, the more books she sold, the more money he received, even from the money she made after their divorce. Joyce told Jude it was okay. Be generous. After all, the poor man would be dead by 1996. It was not in Jude's best interest to warn Claude about his impending doom. He wouldn't have believed her anyway. He would say that his ex-wife was crazy, and alerting him to his own death, well, it would sound like a threat. Joyce essentially told Jude to let Claude's miserable life play out the way it's going to play out. It was destiny. As for Jude Devereaux, she had a life to live. She had books to write and a new man to love. Her tour guide, a gentleman named Mohammed Montassir. He was waiting for her in Egypt. Within a year of meeting Joyce Michaels, nearly everything in Jude's life had changed, and nearly all of it for the better. She was now with her Egyptian boyfriend, spending much of her time in Cairo, flying back to New York for work, meeting with her publisher, and she was hard at work on a new book. The title of the book would be Sweet Liar, where a young woman from the South moves to New York City to uncover a long-hidden family secret, and soon discovers nothing is quite what it seems. And it was a love story, but also a hard lesson about the ways we can hide our true selves, tucking away our greatest fears and brutal truths, all behind a sweet smile. Sweet Liar was destined to be her biggest book yet, and when it was published in 1992, it was a huge success. Everything seemed to be going Jude Devereaux's way. All of it, she believed, thanks to Joyce Michaels. Jude was aware that Joyce had other clients, but at a certain point, Jude realized she needed Joyce Michaels' gift all to herself. And by the mid-1990s, she could afford it. Jude's books sold, and her output as a romance author was prolific to say the least. She had a writing pace of at least one book a year, often two, sometimes even three. Jude asked Joyce Michaels if she would become her full-time spiritual advisor, available whenever and wherever she needed her. Because Jude realized she was going to need all the help she could get, as she found herself in yet another impossible situation. Jude was in her late 40s, but she desperately wanted a baby. She knew that Joyce Michaels' spiritual prowess was her best hope. Jude indeed got pregnant. And in 1997, when Jude was 50 years old, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. It really was a dream come true. And while the science of IVF had made it possible, Jude believed it was Joyce Michaels who manifested this miracle. By the early 2000s, she'd relocated with her family to a large property in North Carolina, where her son had plenty of space to play and plenty of fresh air to enjoy. Finally, Jude Devereaux had everything she ever wanted. The investment she'd made in Joyce Michaels, it was worth every penny. And by the 2000s, she'd certainly spent quite a few pennies. Just to retain Joyce's services, it came out to an annual cost of $1 million a year. Then there were the extras, a few thousand here, a few thousand there, for various blessings. Jude didn't pay close attention. Why would she? She had plenty of money, millions of fans, and one perfect, wonderful child. There were predictions Joyce Michaels got wrong. Her ex-husband, Claude, the one who was supposed to die in 1996, well, that year came and went, and Claude was still alive and seemingly well, which meant Jude still had to keep up her payments with no end in sight. And it turned out her Egyptian boyfriend, Mohammed Montasir, he wasn't the soulmate that she'd hoped he'd be. But Joyce Michaels, she wasn't a genie in a bottle. You couldn't just wish for things and have them happen. In fact, it was a constant battle between good and evil. Joyce made sure Jude understood. They had to remain in near constant contact. Joyce kept very close tabs on Jude, even closer tabs than her ex-husband. When Jude went away on her many travels, she stayed in touch with Joyce through a special phone line. The phone line wasn't Joyce's personal number, but one that was affiliated with something called the Psychic Readers Network, where callers, including Jude, were charged per minute. Sometimes the person on the other end wasn't even Joyce, but someone who claimed to be a member of her family, one who also had the gift and could even channel Joyce if necessary. The cost of these calls would eventually add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. But if Jude ever had any doubts about her finances, Joyce assured her, the more positive you put out there in the world, the more positive you get back. For nearly 15 years, Jude lived with the confidence that she was special. She had special protection and special insight into her future. Through Joyce, she'd come to believe in angels, and that Michael the Archangel protected her and everyone she loved. So where were those angels in 2005? When Jude's 8-year-old son went outside one day to play and never came back. There were different accounts of what happened that terrible day. The boy was either fatally struck by or took a deadly fall from an all-terrain vehicle somewhere on the North Carolina property. But whatever happened exactly to the boy, the authorities were confident it was a tragic accident. Jude was stunned, and she struggled to understand how this happened. She and her son were supposed to be protected. How did Joyce Michaels, the all-seeing psychic, let this happen? Jude didn't know where to turn. She had to call Joyce, who had by then moved to South Florida and had opened up a second branch of Astrology Life with her extended family. In the world of Joyce Michaels, there were no accidents. What happened to Jude's son, this tragedy, was a manifestation of dark and evil forces at work. And Jude needed to know she was not safe. Jude needed to leave North Carolina right now and meet with Joyce in Florida before it was too late. If Joyce Michaels thought about it, she and Jude Devereaux, they had a lot in common. Both women each made their living spinning fantasies for lonely and vulnerable people. Both women blurred fact and fiction in a way that felt so real, they believed it themselves. They each cultivated their own personas, changing their names with something that was more unique and professional. Jude Devereaux was once Jude Gilliam from suburban Kentucky. Joyce Michaels, her real name was Rose Marks. And while she could indeed claim ancestral heritage from a long line of soothsayers and psychics who migrated across 3 continents over the span of 1,000 years, Rose Marks was herself born and raised in Newark, New Jersey. But the crucial distinction between these 2 storytellers was how they ended their fantastic tales. As an author, Jude Devereaux always made sure her novels ended happily ever after. All of the loose ends tied up neatly with a silk bow. In the professional realm of Joyce Michaels, there was no such thing as a happily ever after. Because if she did her job properly, her spiritual journeys with her clients, they'd never end. A roller coaster ride of emotions that kept her clients wrapped and engaged. That is, until they ran out of money. That's when Joyce Michaels would end things with a cliffhanger, abruptly cutting people off the second they ran out of cash. Jude Devereaux wasn't Joyce's only client. There were the various locals and tourists who dropped by one of the family's storefronts, the one near the Plaza Hotel in New York, and then this relatively new venture just outside of Fort Lauderdale. Joyce loved Florida for the slower pace, the gentler climate, and the more relaxed restrictions around the whole psychic business. Back in New York in the 1990s, authorities figured out a way to exert more control over psychic storefronts, cracking down on businesses accused of scamming customers with tactics they used to break up the mafia. Like the mob, psychic operations in storefronts were largely cash businesses, so they'd try to shut down these operations by digging into their financial records, looking for tax fraud or money laundering. In Florida, there was less oversight by local authorities and a greater solidarity in the community, thanks to a powerful and prominent Romani population in South Florida. Rose Marks's family, they were Vlachs Roma, a subgroup of the Romani population who migrated from southeastern Europe to the United States, beginning all the way back in the 1700s. Her family was originally from Greece and came to the U.S. around the turn of the 20th century. Once settled in New Jersey, Rose's father became one of the most respected leaders in the community, a man who drew great pride from his heritage at a time where there were many deep prejudices against that community. Now, it was 56-year-old Rose Marks who was the legend. By 2005, she was the all-powerful matriarch of the mind-reading biz. Evidence of her acumen on full display as she cruised along the beach towns of Broward County in her Rolls-Royce, the Florida sun glinting off her designer sunglasses, illuminating her ghost-white hair. Rose was a controversial figure. She had no problem referring to herself with the pejorative term gypsy. And some said her flashy lifestyle and suspicious businesses gave her hard-working and honest neighbors a bad name. But Rose, this was the life she knew, the one she built, with a gift she never asked for, the ability to see the future. When she was 8 years old, she had her first premonition. A vision that her grandmother was going to die. And when her premonition came true, and her grandmother did indeed die, Rose was frightened. But those around her recognized her talents, and soon she was removed from school, essentially dropping out of public school before she finished the 3rd grade, so she could focus on her gift. And her family could chart her future. This included an arranged marriage for the girl. Rose was married off at the age of 17. Then, using her psychic skills to create a successful business in Manhattan. With that came the expectation she would take care of her husband, have children, and financially provide for her family. This would involve working 12 hours a day, sometimes more, to ensure the business was a success. And by 2005, she clearly succeeded on all fronts. Now widowed, her husband had passed away a few years earlier, she ran the business like a CEO. Rose Marks was the one with the vision. She was the face of the operation, with family members as her de facto employees. This included her adult children and their spouses. Rose was very good. Over the years, she extracted tens of thousands of dollars from her unsuspecting targets, people who lived all over the world. But undoubtedly, by the mid-2000s, she owed her family's great fortune to the grave misfortune of Jude Devereaux. And if anyone expected Rose to feel badly about that, they would be disappointed. As Joyce Michaels, she had done more for Jude Devereaux than the author would have ever done for herself. Without Joyce, Jude would probably still be stuck in her loveless marriage, with a stalled career, and of course, she wouldn't have had her little boy. And what happened to that boy? Maybe Joyce could have predicted it. Maybe she could have stopped it if Jude hadn't moved to that property in North Carolina and seemed so happy she didn't need Joyce anymore. If Jude had just done what Joyce said and given her more money when she'd asked for it, well, maybe this tragedy could have been avoided. And now, with the death of that child, the looming danger for Joyce was Jude deciding that her so-called psychic had failed her, right when she needed her most. And, well, Joyce Michaels couldn't risk it. She had to figure out what should come next in this story. A fantastical future where Jude and her son would be together again, this time forever and ever. Or until Jude Devereaux's money ran out. When Jude Devereaux landed in Fort Lauderdale, she checked herself into a budget motel, a far cry from the palatial Plaza Hotel back in Manhattan. But the two places did share one thing in common. Not too far away was an unassuming storefront that advertised astrology readings for $20 a pop. Of course, all those years ago, Jude walking into that random storefront, it seemed like fate. Her trip to Florida wasn't happenstance, but the impulsive act of a desperate mother whose precious little boy was suddenly, shockingly, impossibly gone. Her only hope was Joyce Michaels, her devoted psychic and savior. Jude, being in the throes of grief, was willing to do anything to be with her son again. She couldn't undo what happened, but she had to ask Joyce if she could see anything. Did she know where her son was? Was he safe? Was he scared? Was he at peace? Somewhere inside that storefront lair, Joyce revealed to Jude she did indeed have an open channel, away to see Jude's son. And oh no, it wasn't good. Her young son was alone, and he was frightened. He was not in hell, but he was not in heaven either. He was in purgatory, trapped, Joyce said, in spiritual limbo. Limbo. Jude was confused and horrified. Was there anything she could do to help her son get out of this limbo? Joyce explained there was a way, but it would require sacrifice. You see, this whole thing started because Jude had dark energy, one that cloaked her entire North Carolina property. And no doubt it followed her here. And it clung on to her son in the afterlife. And the only way this curse could be lifted was with a spiritual cleansing. A cleansing that started with the greatest source of all evil, money. Joyce told Jude she needed to turn over as much money as she could, preferably in cash, so Joyce could perform a cleansing ritual, one that would lift the dark curse and liberate her son's spirit, and his soul would be saved. Joyce promised Jude this was just a spiritual cleanse. You will get this money back. But Jude, she wasn't sure. What did spiritual cleansing of money have to do with her son's death? He was a pure soul. Joyce didn't like to be challenged. How dare Jude Devereaux question her gift after everything she'd done for her? Did Jude want to save her son's soul or not? Joyce snapped. Rattled by Joyce's reaction, Jude was too confused to do much more than obey the command. Somewhere between her checkbook, an ATM, and credit cards, Jude doled out the first in a series of payments and waited. Joyce continued to warn Jude. The dark forces were still at work. And until this money was cleansed, Jude could expect to move around Broward County, from one motel to the next, just to keep her safe. Over the weeks, then months, Jude spiraled into deep despair. Fearing her young son's soul was in torment, Jude grew agitated and began demanding her money back. And that's when Joyce pivoted her plan, and she informed Jude she'd found a new way, a better way, for Jude and her son to be together again. For real. After 15 years, Joyce exerted enormous control over Jude's life, manipulating Jude into believing anything good that happened to her was because of Joyce's intervention. This included taking credit for Jude's successful IVF, essentially claiming responsibility for the existence of Jude's own son. So with that in mind, what Joyce proposed next seemed plausible. Joyce told Jude that she'd found out there was one leftover embryo from Jude's initial IVF treatments 8 years ago. And Joyce arranged for that fertilized embryo to be implanted into the body of a young and healthy woman. And this woman, she was to serve as Jude's surrogate, like a host body, because this embryo was very special. When the baby was born, the child would actually be Jude's son, reincarnated. his soul brought back into the body of this newborn baby. Jude and her son, they could start all over again. It all sounded ludicrous to anyone trying to make sense of it, but Joyce knew her audience. She perfectly crafted this fantasy for the fractured mind of Jude Deveraux. Jude's breakout novel, A Knight in Shining Armor, was about two time-traveling souls who essentially ended up together in a romantic version of reincarnation. Joyce could even prove it. At one point, she took Jude to a local beach. And on that beach, there was a pregnant woman in a bathing suit walking along the sand. Joyce pointed to the woman, and she said, "That girl, she was Jude's angel surrogate. And that baby she carried inside, that was the baby who was destined to be Jude's reincarnated son." Of course, that pregnant woman wasn't going to be some surrogate, and her baby wasn't the soul of Jude's dead son. The truth was, the young woman on the beach was Joyce's own daughter-in-law, who was apparently in on the whole ruse, which meant the baby was never going to be given to Jude Deveraux. That baby would be Joyce's own grandchild. The whole pregnancy soul-swapping scheme was very risky. It was so bizarre. It was hard to believe. But it bought Joyce time, and it kept Jude in Florida, hanging on, hopeful, as Joyce found new ways, new plot twists, and new curses to keep Jude in her control. None of it ever really adding up if Jude were to sit down and really think about it. But Jude was so exhausted, overwhelmed, isolated, disoriented. She didn't have time to think. She could barely write. Her once prolific pace as a romance author slowed down to a smattering of words on a page. The only time she had to gather her own thoughts was when she took pen to paper to write to her boyfriend, Brad Pitt. Jude and Brad were set up through Joyce Michaels, because it turned out Joyce Michaels was more than a mind reader. She was also a matchmaker. And in early 2000, after Jude and her Egyptian boyfriend broke up and Jude moved back to the US, Joyce helped ease Jude's broken heart by letting her know she didn't need to settle. Joyce had a whole roster of A-list clients, remember? The kind of men worthy of a world-famous author like Jude Deveraux. Those A-list contacts included Secretary of State Colin Powell, Prince Charles, and Brad Pitt. But things were, it seems, serious with Brad. They hadn't met in person, but their correspondence, Jude and Brad Pitt, it went back 2 years. If Jude wondered why Brad Pitt's address happened to be a P.O. box in Arizona, that was easily explained. Brad Pitt was a big star. It wasn't uncommon for wealthy celebrities to have multiple residences. Jude herself, at one time, had an apartment in Manhattan, a ranch house in Santa Fe, and this North Carolina compound. And again, she wrote him, and Brad wrote her back. Always with the same Arizona postmark. As for Jude, she was hard to pin down. Her address kept changing. She was never in the same place for very long because these dark forces, they kept following her. Joyce told her this curse was strong, so she had to keep moving so this dark force couldn't find her. Jude didn't know it, but in 2007, there was someone desperately trying to track her down. Not Brad Pitt, but a veteran detective named Charlie Stack. Charlie Stack worked for the Fort Lauderdale Police Department, and Detective Stack, along with his team, were just one part of a massive investigation into widespread psychic fraud. This investigation was the biggest in Florida history. It involved state authorities, the FBI, and the IRS. And this large-scale investigation was aptly named Operation Crystal Ball. For years, there were complaints about clairvoyant con artists who used storefronts and phone schemes to scam people out of their life savings, forcing some into deep debt. There were victims, not just in Florida, but all over the world. These fraud cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute because the scams were hard to prove. Claiming to be a psychic wasn't illegal. Offering psychic readings in exchange for money, that wasn't illegal either. The First Amendment protects everyone's right to free speech, which includes expressing opinions. The First Amendment also defends religious freedom, and spiritual guidance, no matter how dubious, falls into that category. The task force that comprised Operation Crystal Ball planned to tackle this case from a few different angles. The IRS would look into tax fraud, the FBI, wire fraud, and Detective Stack, he and his team in Florida, they were there to find witnesses, individuals who'd spent large sums of money on these psychic schemes and would be willing to share their story. This was going to be a challenge. Many victims of scams, even if they report them, are reluctant to press charges. Admitting in open court that you got duped, it was shameful. But anyone investing these cases, they knew better than to judge. Young or old, rich or poor, anyone could get scammed. And believing you were the exception was almost a guarantee that one day it would happen to you if someone just happened to catch you on the wrong day at the wrong time. Because scams, they aren't a test of intelligence, but a direct exploitation of our emotions. The most ruthless catch us at our weakest moments, times where we are at our most vulnerable, in the midst of a divorce, or just after a death. Early on, Detective Stack's team gained access to a database from a controversial company called the Psychic Readers Network. The Psychic Readers Network, also known as the Psychic Friends Network, was a predatory psychic hotline made famous back in the 1990s and early 2000s because of its late-night infomercials featuring a straight-talking, turban-wearing, tarot card-reading clairvoyant named Miss Cleo. The co-founders of the Psychic Readers Network were based in Fort Lauderdale. And in the early 2000s, the company was investigated by the Federal Trade Commission and eventually shut down over its fraudulent business practices. This included offering psychic readings over the phone for just $4.99 a minute, only for the callers to be put on hold for an indeterminate amount of time. And if the caller gave up and hung up, they would still be charged for the time spent on hold. And sometimes those fees added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. The company often refused to refund someone's money, so customers complained to the FTC, which sparked a lengthy investigation. And in 2002, the psychic hotline was cold busted with a court-ordered financial restitution of $500 million owed back to its customers, and the eventual shuttering of that business. That case was long over, but there were documents from that case in the hands of Fort Lauderdale police that were of great value. Somewhere in those files was a list of high net worth individuals, big spenders, known as whales. And, like plankton on a beluga, they were called whales because scammers could feed off of these big spenders over and over again. Whales were a special category of customers. Complete suckers with deep pockets. On that list was a name, one that stood out to Detective Stack: Jude Devereaux. He recognized that name. She was a famous author. Why would she have her name on this whales list? As he dug into it, he realized the people she was speaking with on that psychic hotline, they were actually part of a smaller boutique scam operation right here in Broward County. A family with a storefront not too far from Fort Lauderdale. And as they followed the trail, the phone numbers and financial information, they figured out it was Rose Marks, also known as Joyce Michaels. So Jude Devereaux, she was a whale, involved in this psychic scam somehow. And by his estimation, she'd been taken for a lot of money, millions of dollars. The question was, would this whale be willing to be a witness? She was a big name, and her long history with this Joyce Michaels was just the thing this investigation needed to make their case. But first, Detective Stack had to find Jude Devereaux. It took time, but he did manage to track down Jude Devereaux to a rundown local motel. When he arrived, the location surprised him. But it was the woman inside the room who shocked him. The woman who answered the door was not Jude Devereaux. At least, not the woman in the author photo. In her photo, she was a glamorous, sophisticated blonde with bright blue eyes and a confident smile. The woman who answered this door, she was disheveled, anxious, paranoid, and fearful. Detective Stark realized the scale of what had happened to this woman. He realized she'd not only been scammed out of millions of dollars, she'd also been brainwashed into believing Joyce Michaels was practically a mystical deity, one who was sweet, kind, benevolent, and all-powerful. Jude Devereaux believed Joyce could not only see the future, she could create life, and she could resurrect the dead. Joyce Michaels, Rose Marks. This woman could have as many names as she wanted, but Detective Stack knew one thing. She was a cold-blooded con artist. Not satisfied with bilking Jude, she reveled in watching this poor woman suffer, pushing her to an emotional edge that nearly drove Jude Devereaux to suicide. Jude even admitted to Detective Stack that before he showed up at her door, she was days away from taking her own life. She was so depressed, so despondent, and so desperate. She thought she was better off dead. Maybe if she were dead, she'd at least get to see her son again. Detective Stack was more determined than ever to get justice for Jude Devereaux. Even if Jude had yet to realize she was, in fact, a victim. She just couldn't see it at first. But over the course of multiple interviews, Detective Stack and his investigators helped Jude Devereaux understand her reality. The woman she knew as Joyce Michaels, she was named Rose Marks, who, with the help of a dozen or so accomplices, many of them members of her own family, she'd scammed Jude out of $20 million. And she'd done this to hundreds, maybe thousands of others. And while Jude went broke, Rose became a multi-millionaire with assets worth at least $40 million. And half of that, at least, was Jude's money. Detectives also had to break it to Jude Devereaux that she wasn't in a long-distance relationship with Brad Pitt. During their investigation, they discovered Joyce paid some woman in Arizona to send those letters. And it was Joyce herself who dictated what the letters should say over the phone. They also found out that she had this woman pose as Prince Charles and the former Secretary of State, Colin Powell. All of this so Rose Marks could control one woman and her vast fortune. Detective Stack couldn't predict the future, but he believed they could build a successful case against Rose Marks, maybe even get prison time. And the best part? It was now Jude's turn to decide what was going to happen next. Soon, Jude Devereaux joined Operation Crystal Ball. Jude worked with Detective Stack and the FBI as a confidential informant. Over a series of in-person meetings and phone calls, Jude captured Joyce on tape talking about the spiritual cleansing scheme, proving exactly how Joyce demanded money from Jude to remove a curse, promising she'd return those funds. And in those recordings, Joyce admitted specific amounts in exact dollars, which was exactly what they needed to prove she was essentially stealing money from her client. Jude had to play along as if nothing was wrong and continued to give small payments, offerings to Joyce. And with every deposit, the FBI could find more evidence of money laundering and wire fraud. Finally, after a 5-year investigation, in August of 2011, Rose Marks and 8 other members of her family were all part of a 28-count indictment, with charges including money laundering and multiple counts of wire and mail fraud. They were all looking at serious prison time. Wisely, Rose's 8 relatives all took plea deals, but she insisted she was innocent. She described herself as Jude Devereaux's life coach, her spiritual advisor, her creative muse. This was a collaboration, not a con job. As evidence, she pointed to Jude's book series about the crime-fighting psychic. And during the trial, the defense called Jude Devereaux's ex-husband Claude, where he testified that he had indeed seen a check years ago for $40,000. And now the memo, it had read, research. If anything, Jude exploited Rose, stealing her story, publishing books, making millions of dollars, not the other way around. Her defense attorney also argued this whole case was a violation of his client's First Amendment rights and classic bias against the Romani community. By the end of the trial, it was really anyone's guess. Then in 2013, in an unprecedented and surprising verdict, Rose Marks was found guilty on most counts, and she was ultimately sentenced to serve 10 years in prison. She was also ordered to pay back the millions of dollars she stole. And to do that, Rose said she planned to write a book. Why not? She knew what it took to make a bestseller, didn't she? And while in prison, she did write a book, but it wasn't a bestseller. It was a self-published, underwhelming guide to Romani culture with the unfortunate title, called Let's Learn Gypsy. Rose was released from prison, and she swore she'd learned her lesson. She was very sorry. And she would never work as a psychic or spiritual advisor ever again. But even if Rose Marks follows all the rules, there are thousands of psychic scammers who've already taken her place, more than happy to take their hustle to an even bigger, less skeptical online audience. According to a 2025 study done by the Pew Research Center, 30% of Americans consult astrologers, tarot card readers, and psychics. And what's the harm? It can be entertaining and enlightening. But according to several psychic forums, there are some key signs of a good psychic. A trustworthy psychic prioritizes clarity over certainty. An ethical psychic focuses on guidance, not dependency. Good psychics don't claim to predict the future. They offer insights into current energies. They help reflect a person's desires and help inform decisions. And lastly, a good psychic helps you feel calm and open. It's a fraud who uses urgency and fear. As for Jude Devereaux, she was praised for going public with her story, and she has since moved on with her life. She is now in her 80s and still writing books, not romance novels. These days, Jude Devereaux, she prefers mysteries. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Dead Sleep. I'll be back in about 10 days with an all-new episode. Until then, nighty-night.